What's the craziest thing you've seen in a high school football game? Our autistic player got the game-winning touchdown. In 2015, our high school football team was an odd mix of talent and heart. We weren't the most skilled group, but we had a secret weapon, Danny, an enthusiastic and lovable autistic student. You know how some kids with autism are weirdly strong? Danny was one of those. He wasn't the most coordinated, but he made up for it with his spirit, dedication, and surprising strength. The whole team loved him, and he quickly became our unofficial mascot. Sometimes, Coach would let Danny join us on the field during practice, and he'd always be on the sidelines during games, cheering us on. The craziest moment came during the most important game of the season. We were up against our biggest rivals, and the tension was palpable. If we won, we'd secure our spot in the playoffs. If we lost, our season would be over. The game was a nail-biter from the start. Both teams were evenly matched, and neither side was giving an inch. The score was tied at 21-21 with only a few minutes left in the fourth quarter. That's when Coach Simmons made a bold decision. He called a timeout and gathered us around. "Listen up, boys," he said, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "We're going to do something a little unorthodox. Danny, you're going in." We all looked at each other in surprise, but we trusted Coach. He knew what he was doing. Besides, we all loved Danny and wanted to see him get a chance to play. We quickly went over the play, and then Danny trotted out onto the field, his helmet a little too big for his head, but his heart full of excitement. The opposing team's players snickered and exchanged smirks, clearly underestimating our secret weapon. Little did they know what was about to happen. The ball was snapped, and the quarterback handed it off to Danny. As he clutched the ball tightly, it seemed like time slowed down. Danny started running, his powerful legs propelling him forward like a freight train. He dodged the other defenders, his unorthodox movements making him hard to read. As Danny sprinted down the field, nearing the end zone, the crowd roared, and we could hardly contain our excitement. But then, the biggest, meanest player on the other team set his sights on Danny and charged, intent on stopping him in his tracks. Danny, caught up in the moment and fueled by adrenaline, did the unthinkable. He lowered his shoulder and barreled into the charging behemoth. There was a loud crash that reverberated throughout the packed arena, and both players went down. The stadium fell silent, holding its collective breath. And then, like a scene from a Hollywood movie, Danny emerged, unscathed and still clutching the ball. The other player, however, was out cold. As Danny stood towering over his opponent, he struck a triumphant pose and hit the whip, which sent the crowd into a frenzy. Our team erupted in celebration and we stormed the field chanting, "Forrest Gump! Forrest Gump!" Danny, our unlikely hero, had just scored the game-winning touchdown and taken down the other team's star player in the process. People who were in the mafia, what's your story? My dad was pretty well established and well known in the mafia world. Obviously, the whole mafia thing never crossed my mind as a kid. All of the stereotypical mobster people I saw were just family friends. Uncles, cousins, buddies, wearing gold chains, expensive clothes, smoking cigars in our kitchen. To me, they were just regular people who always treated me nicely and were always kind to me. Whenever they'd come around, my dad would tell me to go play in my room. He would lock the kitchen door and all I would hear would be muffled conversations, loud laughter, and the occasional silence as they whispered something to each other. I didn't know it at the time, but my dad was involved in a lot of stuff: dealing, racketeering, extortion, car theft, and so on. At the time, I didn't pay much attention to it and didn't know anything about it. My first real exposure to it was probably when I was 13. I came home from school and my mom had just made dinner. We sat down to eat and waited for Dad for a bit, but he didn't show up. My mom called someone, and nobody picked up. Then my dad burst through the door, freaking out, with two other guys, and they ran into his study and started going through stuff. My mom kept asking what was going on and my dad told her that my uncle was arrested. I would later find out my uncle was arrested because he was extorting some local businessmen. The whole court process took a year and my uncle was eventually sentenced to 4 years in prison. They tried to make excuses, but over the years I just got more and more attuned to what was going on. I was friends with a few kids of other mobsters and some of them eventually broke it down for the rest of us because their parents were a lot more open to them about it because they were older. My parents desperately wanted me to stay out of it, but over the years I just got more and more exposed to it. When I was 18, my uncle was supposed to come out of prison in a couple of months and I was driving my dad around town. While we were driving, this guy shot at our car twice. He didn't hit either of us, just the car door. I remember my hands shaking as I sped off. My uncle came out soon after and he had become pretty much unhinged in prison. He was even more mercurial, he didn't have an inside voice anymore, he was unable to form a sentence without 20 swear words, and he was very strict and aggressive with people around him. We were at a bar that a family friend owned and some guy jokingly said, "Haha F you man," after my uncle said something to him. So my uncle punched him in the mouth, choked him, and kicked him in the head. The guy wanted to call the police, so my uncle beat him down again. The bar owner had to pay the guy off and calm him down, while 3 other guys and I held my uncle down. This was around the time that the mafia started to decline. A lot of RICO cases got handed out, a lot of family and friends got incarcerated, shootouts happened, people kept disappearing, running away, turning state informants, and so on. One day, our house was raided by the police at 7 in the morning. I got arrested, but released shortly after. My dad was kept in prison for a year while they deliberated his case, but they couldn't really charge him with anything. During that year that my dad was in prison, our accounts were mostly frozen and we were heavily monitored by the FBI. Their cars would visibly be parked in front of our house. This was around the time I became heavily involved. My family was struggling with money. One of my sisters had gone off to college and it was difficult financially for the family, so I started working with my uncle. There was no real initiation, but I did have to prove myself in a way. My uncle threw me into various jobs and scenarios where he wanted to see how I would react. It was fun for him. One night my uncle called me up in the middle of the night and told me he'd killed someone and needed me to help him get rid of it. I immediately got a bunch of equipment together and stood outside in the freezing cold waiting for him to drive up. He eventually did. He was insanely drunk and he looked panicked. We drove to a secluded area and he opened the trunk. He had ran over someone's garden gnome. He started laughing, then told me to drive him home because he was just too drunk to drive. I didn't find it funny, but he still tells that story when he's drunk to this day. Officially, I was employed at a car shop where my job was car mechanic, but I spent most of my days running errands, taking apart stolen cars, helping steal cars, hiding cars, and so on. My uncle and I started pressing some people for money. My uncle gave me a tire iron and told me to break a guy's kneecaps when he refused to pay some money that my uncle had loaned him. We eventually had to sell our house, and a lot of our stuff got repossessed by the FBI that we never got back, such as cars, jewelry, and even photo albums. When my dad got out, he was a completely different man. He seemed depressed. Thinking back on it, he was always tired, he just didn't care anymore. His eyes always looked tired. He didn't bother trying to keep me out of it anymore. I even remember the first time that we had a meeting a month after my dad got out. Usually, I just drove him there, went inside with him, and then got the go keep the engine running line. But he just slumped down onto a chair and didn't say anything. My heart was pounding, I felt so happy. Over the years I saw a lot of stuff. Bribing police officers, judges, politicians, shaking people down, extortions, rackets, illegal games worth hundreds of thousands, local celebrities paying us for protection. I saw people deal, get shot, get arrested. We used to sell to the Bloods, so some Crips tried to rob us and shoot our car up. They ended up crashing their car into a street light trying to drive off after a drive-by, and one of them got shot. My dad eventually died from a heart attack. I got arrested along with my uncle. He was sentenced to another 2 years, but I got probation. As the years went on, most of the action disappeared. Extorting, loan sharking, racketeering became nearly impossible. Selling is difficult due to the high competition and most people just work in tax fraud, small scams, and car theft nowadays. I dipped out eventually, moved to a different state, got a job as an electrician, and work on cars in my spare time. I have some money saved up. My uncle swears he's out of it nowadays, but he still owns a bar and a nightclub and I know he's still around most of the people that are still involved in it. Either way, he's a made man so he's pretty safe no matter what happens. I'm 30 now, pretty much with no accomplishments in my life, can't date women anymore because my trust in them has been shattered, don't have any kids, and probably never will now. I'm riddled with paranoia. When a car slows down next to me I freak out, when I hear something in my house I jump up. I can't sleep some nights. Parents, what did your child do that was so despicable that you will never forgive them? I regret giving birth to this devil every day. This Saturday, my son will have been sober for 18 months. He got his GED this year, and he starts at community college at the end of August. He finally has a job that I didn't get for him. Soon he will be moving into his own apartment, and he hasn't missed a single appointment with his therapist. He has done everything you would expect of a precocious 17-year-old who hit a rough patch after meeting with a particularly bad influence. He is 29. His mother and I gave him every opportunity we could. I don't expect any praise for that, because, unlike my son, I don't expect praise for doing what you're supposed to. She and I worked hard to give him a loving, stable, comfortable, supportive home. We were involved in his school, we introduced him to music and sports and culture, we fed him healthy meals, and we played with him. He started shoplifting at 15. The first time we caught him, we bodily dragged him back to the store, made him return the copy of Grand Theft Auto and apologize, and offered to pay for any damages. The second time we caught him, we did the same thing. The third time, we started going to family therapy. Therapy seemed to go well, and after a few sessions, the therapist asked for a few one-on-one meetings with him. After 2 of those, the police came knocking on our door, because the little brat had concocted some story about how we were a religious cult who attacked him at breakfast every Saturday, and the dumb therapist actually believed him. Rational heads prevailed, we fired that therapist, and he went through 6 more in as many months, until eventually, we couldn't find anyone who would take him as a patient. By 16, he was drinking. Then we found grass in his bedroom and in our bedroom. He started leaving needles in glass where he knew we'd eventually find them, just to mess with us. I know this because he said so, in those exact words. He had his first intervention and first trip to rehab that year, and his first relapse. He had to repeat a year of high school at 17, which meant he was now the ringleader of a group of other young idiots, who saw him as this totemic mentor shaman who could hook them up with whatever they wanted. I'm also damn sure he started getting with one of his gang's 13-year-old sister around then, but I had nothing to go on but my own instincts, so all I could do was tell her parents to keep an eye on her. No charges were ever pressed, and the family never spoke to me again after that, but they did pull both of their kids out of that school, and my son was furious at me for daring to not let him continue committing this crime. While I was away, he spent an uncharacteristic night at home and on his best behavior. After his mother went to sleep, he followed her to her bedroom. He took a knife with him. He crept into the room, straddled her, put the blade to her throat, and attacked her. I don't know exactly what happened next. I know he held her down. I know she fought. I know he stabbed her. I know she got away and locked herself in the bathroom before he could catch her. I hope that means she kicked him good in the groin. I know she broke the window and screamed for help. I know he ran. I know she was lucky the ambulance got to her before she bled to death. I know he called his friends to brag and beg for a ride. I know the police caught him. I know if I'd been home, or if I'd caught him, I'd have killed him with my bare hands. The state tried my son as an adult. He pled out, but only after making his mother testify and smiling the whole time. She divorced me a month after his sentencing. I looked too much like him. She took her own life a year later. I would be a liar if I said I didn't blame him for her death because I absolutely do. He was sober when she went to her room, sober when he pulled out his knife, sober when he climbed on top of her, sober when he attacked her, sober when he stabbed her, sober when he ran, sober when he called his friends to brag, and sober when the police found him. When I made the mistake of visiting him after the divorce, he laughed and said I could never satisfy her. When I made the mistake of visiting him after she was gone, he laughed again. I should have killed him right there. It is to my eternal shame that I did not. They let him out after serving 3 years. He spent the next 6 years on the streets, in and out of rehab, on and off other people's couches, and would grace me every 6 months or so with a phone call demanding money. Eventually, I refused to talk to him unless it was to drive him back to rehab, and I stopped completely after he stole my wallet. 2 years ago, he came to my house with his aunt in tow and crocodile tears in his eyes. He pretended to apologize. I slammed the door. His aunt barges in to try to shame me into forgiving the man who attacked my wife, caused her death, and laughed about it. He slashed my tires, threw a brick through a window, and drove off in her car. His aunt had no idea that he'd taken our keys, or that he'd been armed the whole time. She blamed me. He guilted her into letting him stay with her, went to rehab and relapsed, then went again, and here we are. My son has pretended to reform before. He has even convinced himself once or twice. But he always backslides, always relapses, always finds new ways to disappoint, and always hurts other people for his own short-sighted benefit. His aunt is already at the stage where she is pretending she must have forgotten where she put some knick-knack or piece of jewelry and has already told me to F off after I've warned her of what my son can, will, and has done before, and what he will do again now that he thinks she is weak. When he messes up again, when he hurts someone else with his ceaseless BS, I will not be there to pick up after him. I am through with him. I am through with his aunt. I cannot talk to her without being overcome with rage and shame as I see the stupid hope I used to have that my son would ever amount to anything, and that I do not need any more disappointment and failure in my life. I am not proud of my son. I am sorry for inflicting him upon the world.
Siblings, what devious secret are you hiding from your parents? It all started when he buried his head under my skirt. He kept trying to dare me to climb up to an old treehouse, which I finally did, only to realize he could see up my skirt as I was climbing up. I yell at him to stop looking and he acts like I was being gross for thinking he was. Whole situation was super weird, so I just brushed it off and never said anything about it again. A few months later, I caught him going through my photos on my laptop. A huge fight ensued, of course, and my parents got involved. He tells them he was trying to delete an ugly picture I took of him, and somehow my parents see it as we're both in the wrong. I don't have anything scandalous on there, but it just felt so off for him to be going through my pictures. 2 years later, when we were moving into a new house, my brother and I found out that we were going to be sharing a bathroom. My brother acted annoyed, but I could see the smirk on his face. He never knocked when I used the bathroom. Instead, he just tried to see if the door was locked. Eventually, the inevitable happens. I forget to lock the door and he barges in. Luckily, I was half decent. I tell my parents about this, and instead of the solution being he should knock, the solution is I should use the guest bathroom downstairs. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, it did. A few nights ago, after a family barbecue, I came back to my room and noticed the sweatpants I had changed out of before everyone arrived were out of the laundry hamper and on the floor. When I got up to do the laundry the next morning, I realized the panties I was wearing with those sweatpants were gone. I wanted to scream my brother's name and storm into his room, scolding him, but there would be no use. The thought of confronting him over it and him gaslighting me again was honestly so exhausting, I just didn't say anything. I knew my younger brother was the culprit but had no hard proof. And I was certain that if I confronted him or told my parents, he would just gaslight me again and make me feel crazy. So, I came up with a plan. I went to the store and bought a few packs of cheap, brightly colored underwear. The kinds of panties an older sister would never wear. I made sure to hide the receipt and packaging so no one would know I had bought new underwear. Over the next week, I started mixing the new panties in with the rest of my laundry. I made sure to wear them once so they would have my scent on them. Just as I suspected, a few days later I noticed some of the bright pink and orange thongs were missing from my dresser. But this time, I said nothing and acted oblivious. The next part of my plan was a bit sneaky. I was eating in the kitchen while my friends were over, and I spilled some food on my skirt. I excused myself to use the bathroom while my brother had friends over. After finishing up, I made sure to not flush the toilet. Then I quickly snuck into my brother's room. Going through his hamper, I found one of the bright thongs I had planted crumpled up among his clothes. Gotcha. Armed with the evidence, I decided to finally confront my brother. With my parents out at dinner, I called him into my room. "I know you've been stealing my underwear," I said bluntly, throwing the pink thong at him. His face turned beet red and he started stuttering excuses. But I cut him off. "Save it. I'm done with you perving on me and then manipulating me into thinking I'm crazy. It ends now." My brother started to protest, but I gave him a death stare. "Unless you want mom and dad to find out about your disturbing panty obsession, you better knock it off." My brother's shoulders slumped in resignation. I'm sorry, okay? I don't know why I did it. Just please don't tell them, he pleaded. I'll do anything, I promise. He was on his knees in the dark room, hands together, looking up at me. My eyes lit up. Anything, you say? Anything. It was a good thing that I was wearing a skirt. It was easy to take off. My brother's eyes grew wide. I handed the skirt to him. Get the stain out of this skirt, I said. Do my laundry until I move out, and make sure my room is cleaned every single day. He agreed, and I actually think he felt ashamed. I walked out of the room to get changed into another skirt. Things have been better since the confrontation. I make sure to lock the bathroom door now, and my underwear stays in my dresser. I'm moving out for college soon, so won't have to deal with his weirdness much longer. But I feel stronger knowing I finally stood up for myself instead of letting him manipulate me. I canceled my brother's wedding over a joke his fiancée made. My brother met his now fiancée Ella at a party 3 years ago. Honestly, we never got along, but I always tried to put up a peaceful front because my brother seemed blissfully happy with her. Ella was mean to me constantly. She would make comments about my weight, make fun of my scars on my arms, my makeup, and especially my dog. She hated animals and hated that I would bring my Labrador to my parents' or my brother's house. It always just felt like something aimed to hurt me. When the two got engaged, she asked me to be her maid of honor since she has no sisters or many girlfriends, and since my brother seemed thrilled, I obliged. What I failed to realize when I accepted the role was that to her maid of honor meant planning the entire wedding. Like I was booking venues, florists, jazz bands, doing everything. Even worse, she expected me to put my credit card down for all of it. Every time I asked Ella about it, she would say that it would all be paid back by her parents before the wedding. Well, flash forward to last week, about 3 weeks before the wedding, and she's unbearable to be around. She can't last more than a few sentences before snapping at anyone. So when I of course brought up the money, it hit the fan. I asked if she had received the updated receipt of everything owed when she exploded. She called me a whole line of terrible names, but the one that stuck out was her saying, "What do you need the money for anyway? Your sick dog is dead now." My beautiful dog named Toasty died about a month before this after he fought the bravest battle with cancer. He was my sole dog and I was devastated. I blinked at her and simply left the room, having no energy to even respond to something so cruel. I went back to my car, and after the 20 silent minute drive home, I parked the car and immediately called the vendors and canceled any deposit under my card. Every single one. After almost 20 calls, all that was left of her wedding was the dress and the flower arch. I texted my brother a short explanation. I told him that every vendor would be contacting him if they wished to keep their services, and they were now responsible for covering everything. And that I would no longer be attending. It was a matter of minutes before my phone started to explode and I just turned it off. It's been a few days and I haven't talked to anyone but my mom, who thankfully understands where I was coming from. My brother has tried to call, but I just feel terrible. Both about what I did and about what she said.
On my childhood diary, it has entries I never wrote. I lost my diary 2 years ago, but this one has entries from yesterday. I've been packing boxes for the past few days, moving out of my parents' place and into my own. Admittedly, there wasn't a ton to do. I'm trying to furnish a whole apartment with a bedroom's worth of stuff. It's strange how it can seem like you own so many things until you move to a larger space. Suddenly, all of the things that spent years next to each other have a whole new open area to be spread across. There was one box that was nearly forgotten because it wasn't a newly packed box. It was a box packed by my parents years ago. The one almost everyone has and has to make a decision at some point about whether to keep it. The box of your childhood things. If my dad hadn't remembered, it would have sat up in the attic for another few years. I wonder what we would have thought as kids, peering into the future, knowing that all our favorite things end up collecting dust, and only ever thought about when you move house. I took the box to my new apartment and began sorting through it. I decided to get it out of the way first, as it was the only box where I wasn't sure of the contents. I didn't know how much I'd be keeping, throwing away, or donating. Putting everything into 3 piles was difficult and emotional, but I was able to make a decision for most things. To say it opened a gateway back into my childhood would be wrong, as it didn't. A gateway would imply I could walk through and live it again. What it provided was a window, one which I could only look through and never open. But what a beautiful, crystal clear window it provided. Sorting through that box was one of the happiest moments of the past few years, at least until I got to the end. The final item in the box was a diary, my diary. It was pink and shiny, cliché, but all the TV shows had this sort of thing in, so it's what I wanted as a kid. I never stuck to many things in my childhood, and this was no different. I used it for about half a year, and even then I missed about half the days. So even after 6 months, it would have only had about 100 entries. I sat there and read every single one, each dated about 10 years ago, and each one making me happier. But the smile dropped from my face when the dates crossed a threshold of impossibility. 2 years ago. Dear diary, I totally forgot about this. My dad got a new job recently and had to store some of his old work stuff in the attic. I helped and found this whilst up there. Reading through the old entries was enchanting, to say the least. Maybe I'll come back sometimes and write more. Alicia. My handwriting, my name. But I hadn't been up here 2 years ago. My dad didn't get a new job 2 years ago. It didn't make sense. I wasn't exactly scared at that point. I didn't know what to think. I was just confused, and so I read on. 1 year ago. Dear Diary, this again. Although I don't remember writing that last year. How strange. It was still cool to read through all of this though. I've just moved out and found this in a box of old stuff. Good job my dad reminded me about it. I'm hoping that living alone isn't as scary as it seems. I suppose only time will tell. Future me, you got this. Alicia. How could this be dated a year ago? This all happened, but it happened the same day I had read it, and I certainly never wrote it. 6 months ago. I'm not doing this diary BS. What the hell is this? I've never had a diary in my entire life. How does this thing know everything that has happened to me as a kid? At this point I started to freak out. This entry wasn't like the others. It wasn't just confusing for me, but clearly whoever wrote it was also confused and concerned. Except, they still seem to think they're me. The next one changed that. 4 months ago. How odd. This entire journal perfectly describes my life up until a couple of years ago. I'm moving out in a few months. I haven't already moved out. But all of the entries as a child perfectly mimic my life, except for one crucial detail. My name is Rebecca. How on earth could this be? The next one was the worst. 2 months ago. Dear Diary, someone just broke in. I'm hiding in the attic, and I found my childhood diary. I've called the police, but I'm scared. I just need to take my mind away from this. The police wanted me to stay on the phone, but I was afraid of making noise. I can hear them downstairs. I hope I get to read this again soon. Writing this makes me feel like I'm going to be okay. It turns this into a memory, and not a final day. I wish I had time to read the past entries, but I don't. I promise I will soon. I just hope that I manage to. The entry ended there. It's covered in dry blood. At this point, I was physically shaking, but I felt like I had the duty to continue this, and so I did. I took out a pen and wrote, Dear Diary, I don't know what this thing is. Will I remember writing this? What kind of power this book has is beyond me, but whatever is going on, I don't like it. I died. I moved out a year ago. My dad got a new job 2 years ago. My name is Rebecca. None of it makes any sense. My pen ran out of ink, so I went looking for another one. I intended to finish the entry, but when I returned, the journal was gone.
Have you ever met your soulmate? Did things work out? Jan and I met in college and were instant best friends. We spent all our time together and were briefly lovers, but we never formally dated because both of us were very much into being wild and free and enjoying our youth. We dated other people on and off, but we talked about it and agreed that a committed relationship between the two of us would be an all-or-nothing kind of thing. Since neither of us wanted to give up our hedonistic, promiscuous, irresponsible lifestyle, we made a point of not committing to a relationship. A few years went by that way, and we were very happy. It was a car accident. Her sisters were 16 and 18, and both were killed in the crash. Dead on arrival at the hospital. Jen was utterly, completely devastated. Her father, though, was even more devastated, to the point where he was legitimately willing to let himself starve to death rather than try to go on living. She moved home, out of state, to take care of him. She cut ties with everyone for a while, even me. I didn't see her again for 2 years. She was so different after that. Before the accident, she'd always been the most joyful, exuberant, positive person I'd ever met. After she came back, she was quieter, sadder, maybe wiser. I wanted to be there for her more than I'd ever wanted anything in the world. Not being able to fix things for her, not being able to make it better, that hurt more than anything I could ever remember. I guess that's when I realized how in love with her I was. I told her that I loved her and that I wanted to be there with her, and she told me that she couldn't handle the idea of any kind of emotional connection for a while. Maybe a few years, she said. Maybe never. Maybe she'd never be able to open up emotionally again. She said she needed space from me, particularly from me. She said she needed to figure out what it meant to be alive in a world where her sisters were gone. She asked me to give her time, and I told her that I'd give her anything she wanted. She told me that she'd never been happier than she was when we were together. I told her the same. I told her that I understood, and that's when we made our pact. I was 25 then, and she was 23. We agreed, if she turned 30 and I turned 32, and we both were single, then we'd get married. She moved to Wyoming, to be alone. I moved to Germany, to get as far away from her as I could. We didn't keep in touch at first, but over the next few years, we built up a correspondence. We wrote letters. We emailed now and then. Sometimes we'd mail each other books that we thought the other would like. Years went on, and we became closer and closer. When I turned 30, I half-jokingly brought up our marriage pact. I told her that I had never fallen for anyone else. I couldn't have fallen for anyone else. I always compared every other woman to her, and in my memory she was perfect. She replied that she was still very serious about our agreement and that she'd never fallen in love with anyone else either. I asked her if she thought she had begun to heal, and she said she had, as much as a person could ever heal from something like that. A year later, she told me she'd like us to meet and spend some time together, to see if the spark was still there. It was. She was living in California at that time, and I found a job there. I'd always wanted to live in California anyway. I proposed to her 6 months later, and she smiled and told me that I had to wait another few months, when she'd be turning 30. I thought it was silly, but at that point, things were going so well that a few months didn't seem like they could matter at all. A week after I proposed, she was hit by a drunk driver. She spent 2 days in the ICU before her body gave out. I went to her funeral. I spoke to her father, but I barely remember what we said. I've never spoken to him since. I don't have the willpower to make myself find out how he's doing. I'm in therapy and trying to learn how to have feelings again, other than blank, mindless, miserable rage. I often wonder if this is what it felt like for her. She made progress. She learned to feel again. That thought is what keeps me going. She did it. She'd want me to do it. What's the scariest thing in the entire world? Rabies. It's exceptionally common, but people just don't run into the animals that carry it often. Let me paint you a picture. You go camping, and at midday you decide to take a nap in a nice little hammock. While sleeping, a tiny brown bat decides to bite in your sleep. His teeth are tiny, hardly enough to even break the skin, but he does manage to give you the equivalent of a tiny scrape that goes completely unnoticed. You wake up, none the wiser. If you notice anything at the bite site at all, you assume you just lightly scraped it on something. The bomb has been lit, and your nervous system is the wick. The disease will multiply along your nervous system, doing virtually no damage, and completely undetectable. You literally have no symptoms. It may be 4 days, it may be a year, but the camping trip is most likely long forgotten. Then one day you get a slight headache. At this point, you're already dead. There is no cure. There's no treatment. It has a 100% on alive rate. So what does that look like? Your headache turns into a fever, and a general feeling of being unwell. You're fidgety, uncomfortable and scared. As the virus that has taken its time getting into your brain finds a vast network of nerve endings, it begins to rapidly reproduce, starting at the base of your brain, where your pons is located. This is the part of the brain that controls communication between the rest of the brain and body, as well as sleep cycles. Next you become anxious. You still think you have only a mild fever, but suddenly you find yourself becoming scared, even horrified, and it doesn't occur to you that you don't know why. This is because the disease is chewing up your amygdala. As your cerebellum becomes hot with the virus, you begin to lose muscle coordination and balance. You think maybe it's a good idea to go to the doctor now, but assuming a doctor is smart enough to even run the tests necessary in the few days you have left on the planet, odds are they'll only be able to tell your loved ones what you died of later. You're twitchy, shaking and scared. You have the normal fear of not knowing what's going on, but with the virus really effing the amygdala, this is amplified 100-fold. It's around this time the hydrophobia starts. You're terribly thirsty, you just want water. But you can't drink. Every time you do, your throat clamps shut and you vomit. This has become a legitimate, active fear of water. You're thirsty, but looking at a glass of water begins to make you gag and shy back in fear. The contradiction is hard for your hot brain to see at this point. By now, the doctors will have to put you on IVs to keep you hydrated, but even that's futile. You were dead the second you had a headache. You begin hearing things, or not hearing at all as your thalamus goes. You taste sounds, you see smells, everything starts feeling like the most horrifying substance trip anyone has ever been on. With your hippocampus long under attack, you're having trouble remembering things, especially family. You're alone, hallucinating and thirsty, confused and undeniably terrified. Everything scares the literal crap out of you at this point. These strange people in lab coats. These strange people standing around your bed crying, who keep trying to get you to drink something and crying. And it's only been about a week since that little headache that you've completely forgotten. Time means nothing to you anymore. Funny enough, you now know how the bat felt when he bit you. Eventually, you slip into the dumb phase. Your brain has started the process of shutting down. Too much of it has been turned to liquid virus. Your face droops. You drool. You're unaware of what's around you. A sudden noise or light might startle you, but for the most part, all you can do is just stare at the ground. You haven't really slept for about 72 hours. Then you die. Always, you die.
Parents, what horrible decision led to you losing a relationship with your child? I had a baby with my son's best friend 4 years ago. I had my son at the age of 21 years old. His father passed away 2 years later. So it was me and my son against the world. When it comes to my dating life, I haven't been so lucky. I did have some random hookups here and there in very short-term relationships throughout my son's childhood. In the beginning of my son's senior year, he brought a friend, Max, home. He was basically at our house every other weekend. I was really happy because my son didn't have a lot of friends. He usually kept to himself. I really liked Max as a person. He was a real sweet guy. We had nice, short conversations whenever he was at our place. We exchanged numbers just in case. He would start sending me messages and jokes. I would respond back. My son didn't mind at all. After 4 months of coming to our house, Max texts me he wants to meet up for coffee out of nowhere. I texted him if it was something urgent or about my son. He responded by saying it's something important. I was curious, so I decided to meet up with him. When I met up with him, he looked very nervous. I asked him what the meeting was about. He told me I can't tell my son about it. He then confessed to me that he was developing feelings for me. I was taken aback by this. I told him that while I was flattered, I had to think about my son. He pleaded with me to just give him a chance. It was so long that I found somebody interested in me like that. Max was already 18 when he was introduced to me and he was a very handsome man. I said yes, but with the condition that it would only be casual dating and my son didn't have to know about it. We met up the next week at his place. I told my son I was going out with my friends. After an hour into the date, we slept with each other. Then we promised to meet up in the near future. Our meetups became very frequent, and as such, our relationship grew stronger. I was beginning to fall in love with Max. We learned more about each other. Max was becoming my main source of joy. I wanted the weekend to start early just to be with Max. It was hard for me to pay attention to anything else in my life. Looking back, it seems that my relationship with Max had a negative effect on the relationship with my son. I had to come up with different excuses on why I wasn't around. I missed out on his soccer games. I think I really messed up when I missed his birthday dinner because I was with Max. I told him that work held me up. It was a week before my son's flight to college that I got a text from Max that my son found out about us. I got it in the middle of work. I was scared to go back home. When my son arrived home, he never uttered a word about the situation. He just pretended that nothing ever happened. He seemed very cold to me. Never looked at me in the eye and gave one-word responses. When it came to dropping him off at the airport, he didn't give me a hug or even look back at me to say goodbye. When I drove back home, Max's car was in my driveway. It was the first time I saw him since I got that text from him. I saw he had a black eye and a broken nose when he stepped out of his car. We hugged each other tightly. I cried in his arms. Once we stepped in my house, I told him how bad I felt for what I did to my son. The worst part was that I wasn't sad my son was leaving but relieved instead. Max comforted me in saying he's just as much at fault for this situation. Max stayed that night. The next day, he proposed to me. I accepted. It's been 4 years now. Max and I have a 2-year-old daughter. He works as a mechanic. The airport was the last time I saw my son. He blocked me on everything. I asked his grandparents if he ever contacted them. His grandfather told me that my son told them everything. He said he will take care of my son, but he told me to never contact my son or them again. 2 days ago, I got a call from my son that he's going to be in town and he wants to meet up in person this Friday. I said yes. When I went to meet up with my son, I did so without Max or my daughter. It was at a local coffee shop. I found him sitting in one of the booths of the coffee shop. He was on his phone. I was really scared. A part of me wanted to tackle him with a hug and beg for his forgiveness. Another part of me wanted to leave before he noticed me. I said his name to get his attention. He didn't even leave his seat. He just looked at me and said hi. I asked if I could sit. I started by asking him how he was doing. He said he was fine. I was about to apologize, but he interrupted me by saying, "Before you apologize, I want to understand how the relationship between Max and you even started." I started telling him everything. When it came to mentioning my meetups, he interjected me and started asking me questions that were difficult to answer. He asked, "So all the times that you were going out, you were lying to me about where you were going, weren't you?" I nodded. "What about the times I asked to spend time with you? Did you lie to me so you could meet up with Max instead?" I started tearing up. It was hard being there. "Did you miss out on events to be with Max? What about my birthday?" That's when I started crying. He told me to save my tears. He said he figured that out soon after he learned about the relationship with Max. He just wanted to hear it from me. He then asked me if I was still with Max. I told him I was married to him and I have a daughter with him. He seemed to need a minute to process that. Then he started speaking. He told me he never had an issue with me dating or meeting someone. In fact, he hoped I found love. He understands that I needed companionship and a type of love he couldn't offer as my son. He told me throughout all these years he felt conflicted because both Max and I were both consenting adults and adults have a right to find happiness. My son admitted he shouldn't have hit Max and was glad he didn't press charges. He said despite all of that, there were some things that he can't get over. He told me he can't get over the fact that I didn't take him into consideration when it came to pursuing the relationship. It was also hurtful to realize that I would value a romantic relationship to the point of being willing to throw away a close relationship with him for it. If I had the attitude of being done raising him and finally pursuing my own life, then that's valid, according to him. However, I would have no right to want to have a close relationship with him in return. Again, that's what he said he believes. He told me he wouldn't have forgotten me when he left for college. He would have wanted me to move close to him after he got a job if he couldn't move close to me. In this ideal world, we would live close by so we could still see each other even after he had a family. He said he loves himself and his life too much to have me back in his life. My son said he works as a mechanical engineer now. He is engaged to the love of his life. She was also raised by a single mom like him until she was 16 when her stepdad came into the picture. Both of them have welcomed him into the family. He told me his future in-laws and his fiancée are his family now. He said he was getting a job near them. He finally admitted that he just wanted closure before permanently cutting me off. He told me not to contact him or his family at all. He made it clear he wouldn't be there for me at my last stage of life or even come to my funeral. He made it clear he won't even hold my hand when I pass away. I won't have the privilege of knowing his fiancée or his future kids. He made it clear that if his half-sister ever contacts him as an adult, he'll be upfront on why he doesn't want a relationship with her. He said goodbye to me and left. I cried so hard that I got the attention of the people in the coffee shop. I was crying on the way back home. I don't even know how therapy can even help. I never felt so much emotional pain in my life before. What do I do now?
I've been a straight man my entire life. I think I accidentally just entered a relationship with my male friend. Last year I had to move in with my parents because I was having a hard time finding a new place to rent after a really bad breakup with a girl. My parents and I don't get along great for a lot of reasons, and it made everything a lot worse, so to get out of that I eventually decided to apply for some jobs in other places. At the time I really didn't want to, since I'd lived in that city my whole life and I liked my job, but I just couldn't stay with my parents anymore. I found a job pretty quickly because this hotel was reopening after changing owners and they weren't finding staff easily, so I ended up moving here in October. In the beginning I wasn't socializing much because it's really hard to find friends here when everyone already knows everyone. My country and region are doing well, no confirmed cases in town yet, but it definitely didn't help with making friends. I've also been pretty busy because I decided to buy a house. It just kinda happened because my boss knew the previous owners and it was super cheap since it needed a lot of work, but it definitely made this move feel very permanent. Then in May this guy, Eric, and I got stuck in the social distancing queue outside the pharmacy together and started talking. I told him I was new and he invited me to a barbecue with his friends. Not gonna lie, I'm not great with new people, but they made me feel welcome and were all very nice. After that we just kept hanging out, mostly me and Eric, which I thought was because he was quite careful during these times and only saw his big group of friends outside. Plus we were the only two who weren't in a relationship or had kids, so it made sense in my head that we were alone a lot. I'd cook him dinner and lunch since I'm a chef, and he'd show me great hiking places and help out a lot with the renovations on the house. I also started telling him about the breakup and stuff, and even though I feel like I've moved on, it was still nice that he was so understanding. A week into our friendship, I knew our relationship would be different. I just didn't know what the difference meant yet. Then like 2 to 3 weeks ago he called and asked if I wanted to have dinner on my next night off, and also said, "Just you and me." He seemed kinda weird and formal, but I assumed it was something else going on and just said yes, to which he responded, "It's a date then." I assumed he meant that as a playful line because I have friends who have done that in the past. He picked this restaurant in another town that was relatively fancy that I'd never been to. I drove him home afterwards, he told me goodnight and that he'd had a great time. Usually we're not that formal with each other, but we weren't really acting that different during dinner, so again, I didn't think much of it. Then over the next week or so he started sending hearts in texts and would call me some pet names here and there. This is the first thing that stood out to me a lot. Then earlier this week he grabbed my hand while we were out during his lunch break, and that's when it finally clicked. It really caught me by surprise and I didn't know how to react, so I tried to play it cool and go along with it. Then yesterday he texted and asked if we were still on for our movie night on Sunday. I just said yeah of course, and I started to panic a bit. I grew up pretty conservative and I guess didn't question my preferences a lot, even when I got to university, and a lot of other people were. I've always been awkward when it comes to that stuff, and I never really made the first move with any of the girls I've dated. But I've been thinking about it for the last few days and I've realized I really like him. All the stuff he's done never made me uncomfortable, quite the opposite actually. He's cute, definitely what I would have said is my type, but like a guy version, and it feels different than any friendship I've ever had. Like again, looking back I definitely wasn't acting super platonic with him. We got close really fast, and if I'm being honest, if he'd been a girl I also would have assumed that's where this was going. My one issue was that I was embarrassed and scared. So we had our dinner and movie night soon after and I was very nervous. Mostly because I was scared that how new it was to me was going to be a deal breaker. But Eric came over and I think he instantly realized I was acting weird. He didn't say anything while he was helping me cook, but then when we sat down to eat he almost immediately asked what was up. So I basically said something like, "I really like you and I want to see where this goes, but I want you to know it's very new to me and I'm not sure you're cool with that." He asked what exactly was new to me and I said I'd only dated girls before. This then led to a conversation where I couldn't avoid telling him that I didn't realize we were dating until that lunch. He actually got really quiet for a few seconds after that and I was scared he was upset, but then he just laughed. Basically, he thought I'd been flirting with him for quite some time and all of his friends had been saying things like, "He seems so into you, it's really obvious, he's probably just too shy to make the first move." He even mentioned some other stuff we or I had done that I gotta admit definitely doesn't sound platonic when he retells it. So, I can see why they thought that, and ultimately they were right I guess. Also, during that lunch he'd apparently thought I was reaching to grab his hand, so he reached out too, otherwise he probably wouldn't have done it because he said he's never been good at making the first move physically. He said when he asked me to dinner that was a huge deal and his friends had tried to hype him up for a while. He explained he was super nervous, so that was probably why I didn't realize that he was asking me out. Anyway, we ended up talking a lot after dinner. He didn't come out publicly until a year or so ago either, so he definitely understood that I don't have a lot of experience. He hasn't had a lot of relationships in general since he hadn't come out, and it's a pretty conservative area, so there aren't a lot of guys who are out of the closet here. He actually admitted that he'd even been nervous to talk to me that first time we met since I looked kind of like a lumberjack. He also knows rumors travel fast here, especially when someone doesn't really fit in, so I guess he was worried that I'd fit the small town conservative type or have heard all the gossip. The whole "it's a date" thing, for example, would never happen between two guys who are just friends here. I've definitely noticed the culture, and it's something we talked about too, since being out here isn't always easy, so we might try to keep it low-key at first and mostly tell his friends and some of mine. We decided we want to take it slow, but we also realized we've basically been half dating since May, so it felt weird not to make it official. So I guess I've got a boyfriend now. My wife's best friend killed my wife. Now she wants to speak at her funeral. My wife and I had a baby last December. It was a traumatic birth and my wife developed postpartum depression. While she was originally going to go back to work after the birth, she'd been struggling enough that we decided to wait until our daughter was a year old and reassess. So we had her start going to therapy weekly. With my wife home full-time, I had to work increased hours. This is something we discussed prior to making this decision, and she knew this from the start. A few weeks ago, my boss approached me about a project that would require a lot of overtime in a short amount of time. It would both be great financially and for my career. I talked to my wife about it and she agreed that I should say yes to my boss. For the 4 weeks I'd be working on this, my mother-in-law and my wife's best friend, Jessie, would come help out with some of the duties that I typically do. Jessie is a stay-at-home mom with a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. She began coming over during the day and would watch the kids with my wife. 3 weeks into the project, it became clear that we'd need a few more weeks to get it together. I went home that night and talked to my wife about it. She said she was okay with it, but got very cold in the days after. It wasn't unusual behavior over the past few months, so I didn't think much about it and tried not to take it personally. During the last week of the project, I got home one night and saw that Jessie was still at the house. I didn't think much about it, said hi to her and my wife, and then went to go check on our daughter. Before I could get to her room, I heard Jessie say something along the lines of, "He doesn't even stop to greet you." Definitely a sign. I turned around and asked what it was a sign of. Immediately, my wife started crying and Jessie started accusing me of having an affair. She told me that I must hate my wife because she has PPD and that I am not attracted to her because she gained weight from the pregnancy. Neither of these things were true. I was trying my best to help my wife through her PPD while supporting our family. And I think she looked perfect how she was at that moment. She just didn't want to be physically intimate and I didn't want to push her. Jessie then demanded to see my phone. I told her no. She told me that's a sign that I'm guilty. I told my wife that I would let her see my phone if she wanted to. She nodded and something inside me broke. I guess it was the thought that she actually believed I was having an affair really got to me. And that she didn't trust me after everything we've been through. Well, she looked through the phone and there was no evidence. Jessie started saying that I deleted the evidence. She started screaming and woke up our daughter, so I told her to get out of the house. Eventually, she left and I went to calm our daughter since my wife was still on the couch crying. When my daughter was asleep again, I sat down with my wife and tried to talk to her about what's been happening. She told me that she'd been worried ever since I started working all the overtime. I told her that we'd talked about how good of an opportunity it was and she agreed to letting me take on this project. She said it was very suspicious to increase the length of the project. I told her that sometimes that happens. She wanted more evidence, so I showed her messages and emails with timestamps from work and pay stubs showing the overtime. She said she believed me and was sorry for doubting me. She explained how Jessie had been telling her that these were all signs that I was cheating. I asked her why she believed Jessie more than me, and why she didn't come to me with her concerns. She didn't have a real answer. A couple weeks and the project was over. I actually scaled back and was trying to work a little less than I was before the project so I can spend more time with my wife and daughter. But I felt so burnt out trying to do everything and I became resentful because in the back of my mind, I knew that my wife didn't trust me. I tried bringing it up a couple times but my wife would tell me it's not the time and that she's tired or sad. I would try to be mindful of her feelings but I wondered if that meant that I could never have any of my own. So a few days later I approached my wife and told her that I was going to find a therapist. I didn't connect it to her accusations or anything, just said that I was having a tough time and needed therapy. She shrugged and told me to do whatever. Next day, I got home from work and our room and my home office were ripped apart. Things everywhere. Important papers scattered. I don't see her but our daughter's in her room crying. My wife left her alone, her cell phone's off. I call my in-laws and a few friends, but no one's seen her. I'm starting to get worried and I call my mom to see if she can babysit while I go out and look for her. Before my mom can get home, my wife gets back. Jessie's driving. Jessie doesn't come in but my wife does. She's clearly upset, been crying. I ask what happened. I thought at first the house might have been robbed. She starts screaming at me that I'm being unfaithful and that the therapy is a front so I can meet my mistress. I try to calm her down and tell her that's not true, but she comes at me and hits me. That's when my nose was broken. When she realized what she did, she sat down on the couch, went comatose, and just stared at the wall. I went into my daughter's room and locked the door. I called my mom to tell her what happened and my mother-in-law to ask her to come over and take care of my wife. I packed a bag for my daughter and when my mom got there, we left. My wife didn't even look up. We dropped my daughter off with my dad and then went to urgent care for my nose. I got blood all over my mom's new Subaru. My daughter and I were, at that point, staying with my parents for a while and my wife was staying with hers. That's when I started looking into getting a restraining order against Jessie and thought about separating with my wife. I loved her but I wouldn't live with someone who hurt me and who could potentially hurt our daughter. I did not want a divorce in hopes that my wife would get the treatment she needed and we could work things out. My in-laws had told me that they were looking at inpatient treatment at a local hospital. On the following Sunday night she came to my parents' house and demanded I give her our daughter. Because she had left her alone for several hours the last time she was responsible for her and had gotten physical with me, I refused. I offered to let her come in and spend time with her while my parents and I were present, but she didn't want to come in and wanted to take our daughter with her. She was upset but left eventually. A few hours later, she drove her parents' car into a tree and died. My wife passed away early Monday morning. She was convinced by her friend Jessie that I was having an affair that I did not have, which had caused a mental break and killed her. The friend, Jessie, came to see my daughter and me yesterday. After some tears, she told me that she was planning to speak at my wife's funeral. She had already cleared it with my in-laws but was letting me know as a courtesy. I told her she would not be speaking at the funeral. We fought and she left after telling me that I was a jerk and not the only person who loved my wife. I talked to my in-laws who were adamant that Jessie be allowed to speak. She and my wife have known each other since they were kids and my in-laws are close to her. We're all very fragile right now and I fear that pushing this further would hurt my relationship with my in-laws, which I don't want. Still, the thought of seeing Jessie up there at my wife's funeral makes me feel sick. I don't think I can stand to listen to her, knowing that she took joy in my wife's deteriorating mental health and picked up my wife, leaving my daughter home alone. That being said, I don't trust myself to make the best decisions right now. My mind's clouded by grief, guilt, and fear. My parents are split on what to do and I don't have the energy to reach out to my friends.
My older sister is demanding I either abort or let her adopt my baby. Now I'm terrified she might kidnap mine. I am currently 19 weeks pregnant. My partner and I are very excited, as this is our first baby and we have been trying for a few months. We announced the pregnancy a month ago at a dinner party we hosted, and everyone seemed surprised and overjoyed. My sister, Kim, immediately burst into tears and asked me how I could do this to her. I stared at her, and asked what? She started ranting, saying that I always got everything I wanted and that she knew I got pregnant just so I could rub her infertility in her face. She screamed at me for 5 minutes about how I didn't deserve to be a mother and she should be the one pregnant right now. My parents left with her soon after, and the party was basically over. I was really disturbed by my sister's reaction, because we had been pretty close before, and she had never done anything like this. Kim called me the next day, apologizing for how she acted at my announcement and asked if we could meet up for coffee. I accepted. We met up and she pretended as if nothing had happened. Then she started a big speech about her infertility, how heartbreaking it is to be growing life inside of her, just to lose it, and how she had always wanted children of her own. She then proceeded to ask me if I could consider getting an abortion, to make things fair, or letting her adopt my baby. I stared at her and asked if she was serious. She said she was. I just dropped my part of the bill on the table and left. Her husband, Liam, then texted me a rant that night about how I'd made Kim cry, and how all they wanted was to be parents. He went on about how this meant so much to them, and I owed them for being more successful than them. Keep in mind, my partner and I invested many years into our jobs, and we have worked very hard to earn what we earn now. I told them that my partner and I had been hoping for kids too and that I was not giving up my baby. He hung up. Then Kim sent me a long 4-page letter about how she had always wanted to be a mother, and could I consider either abortion or letting her adopt my baby. She told me how I should care about my older sister's happiness, how she would make a better mom, and how the oldest kid should have the first grandchild. She then told me I could always just have another baby since it was so easy for me to conceive. After that, she quieted down some, and I thought we were done with this. Except she wasn't. She had posted my sonogram on her Facebook, and captioned it "Liam and I are expecting. We can't wait to meet our little princess." I was seeing red. I texted her and demanded she take the post down. No reply. I texted Liam. No reply. So I called my mother and told her what happened. She was able to make Kim take the post down, luckily enough. Kim has called me petty for calling my mom and has continued to demand I give up my baby. I sent her a letter explaining that I had had enough of her nonsense, I am keeping my baby, and that I recommend she get some help. I added that if she continues, I will not hesitate to call the police. This weekend, however, was the absolute last straw. My mom and dad have the spare key to my house, and while she was over at their house for brunch, she took the key. While my partner and I were at work, she broke into our house and stole all the clothing, blankets, nappies, bottles, and pretty much any other item we had bought for the baby. It was later returned after my mom found it in her car. I called the police, but they told me I couldn't do anything because I had no proof and because it was all returned. My partner and I are moving in April, but I'm still scared my sister will find out where we live and take my child. I get that she's upset and jealous, due to her infertility, but that shouldn't mean I have to give up my baby. My parents know about this, and they have been doing their best to get her some help. She doesn't want to adopt, because she wants a child that's her own flesh and blood. I'm due in August, and the stress she's causing cannot and will not be good for me or the baby. My partner is looking into a cease and desist letter. Is there anything else I should do or say? I'm scared for my baby.